If you didn't know before, you're going to learn today. A well-organized lie defeats a disorganized truth every time. And your girl is coming through to do what I got to do. And I'm going to do what I got to do. I'm standing tall. I'm standing strong. Yay. You know what it is. Pseudo killers on deck. Peace, everyone. My name is Chani Kinsler, also known as CK the Poet, and this is the Death to the Pseudo series, where we will be learning about various illogical thinking and errors in reasoning a lot of misinformed, ignorant, and scientifically illiterate individuals use, like logical fallacies, faulty generalizations, also confirmation and cognitive biases. These videos are important to do because individuals are displaying a lot of faulty thinking that mislead and misinform a lot of people. And these people are a danger to the Black community and a detriment to the minds of the would-be future critical thinkers. In this video, we are going to talk about one of the most used and most common logical fallacy, ad hominem. We're going to go over what it means, why people use it, why it isn't okay, exceptions to using ad hominem attacks, and how to avoid using it ourselves, as well as how to engage people that are using these attacks against you. But before we get started, we're going to go over some quick terms. These are some terms that I thought would be important to go over before we go further. Starting with premise. When you make a declarative statement or claim about a subject matter which enables a reader, audience, or opponent to either agree or disagree with the premise in question, and in doing so understand the logical assumptions of the argument. Non sequitur, Latin for it does not follow. It means that the conclusion reached does not follow from the premises. Equivocation. Equivalence is drawn between two subjects based on flawed or false reasoning. This fallacy is categorized as a logical fallacy of inconsistency. Colloquially, a false equivalence is often called comparing apples to oranges, also known as ambiguity. Then there's logical fallacy, the Latin noun fallacia, meaning trick or fraud, sometimes deliberately. A mistake or error that is usually common having bad reasoning or attempt at deception. Then there's appeal to emotion. This appeals to an audience's sense of compassion and encourages them to ignore not only the relevant facts on the topic which have been presented, sometimes yet to be presented. Finally, there's the Dunning-Kruger effect, a cognitive bias in which unskilled individuals suffer from illusionary superiority, mistakenly rating their ability much higher, thinking they are smarter and more capable than they actually are. Note, this is the opposite of imposter syndrome, those that undervalue the intelligence or skills they actually have. So what is ad hominem? This is a logical fallacy which is used to make remarks against you or your opponent in a personal capacity, rather than to make attacks against their argument. The term ad hominem translates from the Latin for against the man, which shows us clearly what this fallacy is all about. This type of fallacy is a way of countering an opposing point of view on a more personal level, and when used makes remarks regarding topics which are completely irrelevant to the discussion which is taking place, therefore losing its logic. The ad hominem fallacy may make personal comments about the character of the opposition, or it might attack their motives for having an argument in the first place. Both of these which have nothing to do with the argument itself. So now that we've gone over ad hominem and what it means, now we're going to dive a little bit deeper on the different ways somebody can do an ad hominem attack against you. There are four of them, starting with abusive. These are personal abuse and attacks, damning the source, name calling, needling to anger, also refutation by character. Such attacks are often effective distractions or red herrings because the opponent or opponents feel it's necessary to defend themselves, being distracted from the topic of the debate or discussion. Then there's circumstantial, also known as appeal to motive, appeal to personal interest, and conflict of interest. This is questioning the motives or vested interests, suggesting that the person who is making the argument is biased or predisposed to take a particular stance, claiming the argument is invalid. Next, there's guilt by association, also known as association fallacy, transfer fallacy, bad company fallacy, company that you keep fallacy, and they're not like us fallacy. when the source is viewed negatively because of its association with another person or group who is already viewed negatively. Finally, there's 2, Querque. This is Latin for you do it too, or 2 wrongs make a right fallacy. This is rejecting the criticism of one's argument or actions by accusing one's critic or others of thinking or acting in a similar way. Like in its variation, whataboutism or whataboutry, that attempts to discredit an opponent's position by charging them with hypocrisy without directly refuting or disproving their argument. Claiming personal inconsistency, pointing out that the one making the argument is not acting consistently with the claims of the argument, trying to convince the audience their argument is not worthy of consideration. To the right, you'll see a small poster that I decided to add to this slide where it goes into more detail and example in regards to ad hominem and the different ways someone can commit an ad hominem attack against you. So before we move forward, there are some common logical fallacies that I wanted to go over that are usually paired with in combination when someone does an ad hominem attack, or sometimes it might be done either before or after someone does an ad hominem attack against you. These are dangerous distractions that can derail a conversation. Starting with red herrings. This is when a premise or premises are logically unrelated to the conclusion, being a type of distraction or diversionary tactic that people will use. Then there's appealing to misleading authority. Statements of a false authority figure who is framed as a credible authority on the topic being discussed. For more on this, see Appealing to Authority video from the Pseudo Killer's library. Next, there's the generic fallacy. An argument or an idea is evaluated on the basis of where it comes from, irrelevant history. It is fallacious to either endorse or condemn an idea based on its past rather than on its present merits or demerits, unless its history is in some way relevant to its present value. Next, there's poisoning the well, also known as discrediting or smear tactics. When someone does this, they're usually committing a preemptive ad hominem attack against you, priming the audience with adverse information about their opponent from the start, in an attempt to make their claim more acceptable or discount the credibility of the claim. An important distinction needs to be made here. Ad hominem attacks happen usually after a claim is made. Poisoning is done usually before the opponent has a chance to make a case, let alone even speak. Next, there's straw man fallacy. Substituting a person's actual position or argument with a distorted, exaggerated, or misrepresented version. Next, there's etymological fallacy. It's a semantic error in which the mistake of confusing the current meaning of a word with the meaning of one of its etyms, or earlier forms. Since the meaning of words change over time, the meaning may differ. The fact that a word historically derives from an etym may be interesting, but it cannot tell us the current meaning of the word. Context matter. Finally, there's begging the question, also known as pretentio principii. This is an unproven premise or a question that assumes the conclusion is true, going to a rabbit hole of circular reasoning. This can be used in an ad hominem attack. You will also see this in poisoning the well too. I'll leave this quote with y'all. One should keep in mind that an argument can and must stand or fall on its own, regardless of who makes it. So why do people do this? Of course, there are many reasons why someone might use an ad hominem attack against you, but these are a couple ones that I thought we should mention here. One would be to attempt to make the other person angry, taking attention off the argument and perhaps even making the other person look foolish. 2. They engage in a personal attack as a means of ignoring, discrediting, or blunting the force of a counter-argument, attacking the straw man. For this reason, any argument that uses what the arguer finds personally distasteful about an opponent as a reason for ignoring or rejecting their argument or criticism cannot be a good one. 3. Usually this is made out of desperation. When one cannot find a decent counter-argument, a way of avoiding the obligation of providing an effective rebuttal to a criticism or counter-argument. This also violates relevance criterion of a good argument. See the burden of proof video from the Pseudo Killer's library. Finally, there's forestalling disagreement fallacy. This is an attempt to make an opponent or the audience unwilling to meet the argument. Adults usually have learned to avoid needless quarrels and to steer clear of embarrassment, so they develop skills in phrasing their ideas in ways that will forestall disagreement, and in turn are silenced by the implied threat contained in assertions that are phrased to make a disagreement embarrassing. For example, some expressions you might hear some people use when they're talking with their opponent is, "It's obvious," "Everybody knows," "Clearly," "Of course," "As anyone can see." These expressions serve the double purpose of assuring the audience that it is not necessary to think about the problem and discouraging those with the audacity to challenge not to. So I leave y'all with another quote. A person who makes fallacious arguments, especially habitually, may be a bad arguer or even a dishonest person, but even the worst arguers sometimes make good arguments. Similarly, sometimes even the best people make bad arguments. So why is this not okay? Some things you need to keep in mind is that assuming that someone has something to gain from a position they hold, assuming of course they are not actually guilty of conflict of interest, could possibly not be true and may weaken your argument and position. It may make you look foolish and unintelligent in the process. Although a person may have questionable motives, personal characteristics, or behavioral issues that might affect our assessment of their testimony, it should have nothing at all to do with our evaluation of the person's argument. To allow such things to affect our assessment of another person's argument would put us in a position of committing an ad hominem fallacy. Using a joke, pun, or a bit of ridicule as a means of ignoring or discrediting the criticism or argument violates the rebuttal criterion. See the burden of proof video from the Pseudo Killer's YouTube channel. This requires that they effectively rebuke the substantive point in criticism or argument. Making fun of or ridiculing an argument or its author is clearly not a way of meeting the rebuttal criterion of a good argument. Sometimes there might be perceived inconsistencies between a critic's words and deeds, but this does not relieve an arguer of the responsibility of effectively rebuting criticism of their argument or the position it defends. The crucial point here is that the indefensible behavior of another is not sufficient reason for abandoning the obligation to address an arguer's criticism or argument. Even though the inclination to do so is emotionally compelling, one usually doesn't fully recognize their fallacious character until it's pointed out and brought to their attention. Despite that, this could show you are not focused on the subject matter. And finally, doing an ad hominem attack on someone, even if they deserve it, it can be unfair to the audience in providing them with a fair conversation or debate with sound reasoning. It destroys civil discourse and influences them to be distracted with irrelevant details, causing the discussion to go off on tangents and further away from the original topic. So, when is it okay to attack your opponent? There is some exceptions to the rule when it comes to using an ad hominem attack. Let's get to it. Exception: if a person states facts relevant to the argument, points out an inconsistency in your own behavior, there is no reason to be intimidated or silenced by such a charge. Exception: when the attack on the person is relevant to the argument, it is not a fallacy. Example: if the issue being debated was the best way to raise and take care of children, then you pointed out that your opponent has a pattern of abusing and harming children, this would not be an ad hominem. Exception: as the bias or conflict of interest becomes more relevant to the argument, usually signified by a lack of other evidence against the claim, the argument is seen as less of a fallacy and more as a legitimate motive. Example: when someone seeks to gain from this financially or it reinforces their belief despite the facts. Exception: if one can demonstrate that the connection between the two characteristics that was inherited by association is causally linked, or the probability of taking on a characteristic would be high, then it could be potentially valid. Exception: at times, an opponent might not want to expand on the implications of their position. Despite the fact that we should avoid non sequitur fallacies, Making assumptions might be the only way to get the opponent to point out that their interpretation is not accurate or forces them to clarify. Basically, you are intentionally using an ad hominem logical fallacy to get your opponent to either commit or retract their claim. Exception: claiming testimony and authority where the person being criticized is advancing argument from authority or testimony based on personal experience or others' experience rather than posing a formal reasoning or fact. Like, for example, when a lawyer is attacking the credibility of a witness in a trial and the witness has been convicted in the past for lying. They could be engaging in an ad hominem attack, but not necessarily a fallacious one. However, every ad hominem argument is an ad hominem attack. This might suggest the conclusion that the witness should not be trusted, which would not be a fallacy. But, you still have to deal with their claim. So now we are getting to the favorite part of the video, everybody's favorite part, CK the Poet. How do we fight back? How do we engage with the pseudos that are using logical fallacies against us? Specifically in this case, ad hominem attacks. So when you're verbally attacked, you can take it as a compliment to the quality of your argument. It's usually a sign of desperation on their part, and you could just ignore them. You could also admit your lack of self-control or willpower has nothing to do with the truth or claim of the proposition and confront the arguer who commits this logical fallacy by insisting that they set aside concerns about your possible inconsistency and evaluate the merits of your criticism or argument. If you have the opportunity, you could insist that a fruitful or constructive debate is not possible unless both sides make either attempt to understand what is being said. If your opponent continues to misrepresent your position, call attention to that fact and correct the distortion in each counter response. If the arguer persists in personal attacks, or rather than responding to your criticisms or argument, you should try to find a way to encourage them to separate the evaluation of a person from the evaluation of the merits of the person's idea or argument. But remember, don't debate issues on the distorter's terms. Being forced into defending a misrepresented version of your position is not okay. Call out the straw man fallacies. We need to be careful with testimonies. The origin of testimonies, whether firsthand, hearsay, rumors, it can carry some weight in evaluating it. For example, the testimony of a liar should be given little credit, but whether an arguer is a liar or in other way a bad person is irrelevant to whether the argument is valid, sound, or cogent. Similarly, even the most truthful and honest person may make a mistake in reasoning. So if what a person says or writes is testimony, then facts about the person may be relevant to evaluating it. Also, when you're abusively attacked, you will be tempted to counterattack in the same abusive way. But giving in to that temptation will not help advance the debate on the issue in question. The most constructive response is to point out to the arguer that they are being abusive and then politely ask for an evaluative response to your argument or criticism. Sometimes just simply saying, well, what do you think of my argument, will do. Finally, although quite difficult to attack the poison in the well fallacy when it's used against you, because even your attack or response on such a reasoning supposedly comes from a contaminated source. Perhaps the most constructive approach in such a case is to confront the issue directly. One reason someone might want to silence you is that they think that what you might have to say might seriously damage their position. Just say, I have something significant to say on this issue, and I'd be interested in your response to it. Alright, you guys, before we wrap it up here, there is one more thing that I wanted to go over. Diversionary humor. Y'all need to watch out for this debate tactic. It's usually used to divert people from the topic, whether it's you or the audience. A lot of times by injecting humor or ridicule into the argument in order to cover up an inability or unwillingness to respond appropriately to the opponent's criticism or counter argument. It is an effective diversionary tactic because a clever and well-delivered remark can quickly blunt the force of an opponent's argumentative advantage, particularly in the minds of the audience, towards whom such humor is, like I said before, directed. When someone does this can quickly bring an audience over to one side. Even though there's no logical justification for such a shift, it could be a pun created from a remark in an opponent's proposal or argument. It could be a not so serious response to a serious claim or question. It could be a humorous anecdote or just plain injection or interruption to ridicule an opponent's position, remarks, and character, rather physical or otherwise. And most people that use this tactic, they're aware of its diversionary effects. If you're in a situation where someone is using humor to introduce into an argumentative context, sometimes it could be genuinely clever. You could perhaps show appreciation of it. Fallacious arguments, they don't always have to be cheerless. Basically, you could just joke back with them. A response in kind, it can be an effective move as a means of leveling the field of play at the appropriate moment. However, you should tread lightly. It can backfire on you. Well, everybody, here are my sources. We should try to be on our best behavior and avoid committing ad hominem attacks ourselves, but it's almost impossible to avoid when your opponent refuses to be reasoned with, ignores all facts and evidence, and does ad hominem attacks against you and shows signs of suffering from the Dunning-Kruger effect. We all want to just call them what they are: ignorant, lacking comprehension, stupid, incompetent, or slow, especially when people engage in attacks against us. And I will be honest, I am guilty of committing ad hominem attacks, fallacious ones and non-fallacious ones, and probably will continue to do so in the future. But just keep in mind that you still have to address their claim. You still have to beat up the pseudo. You still have to refute what they're saying with logic, facts, and evidence. I hope everyone learned something about ad hominem attacks, why people do it, why it isn't okay, exceptions to using them, and how to avoid them, and how to fight the pseudos using fallacies against you. If you have a logical fallacy that the pseudo killer should do next, drop it in the comment section below. The comment with the most likes will be done, and you will be given credit in that video. If you know of or can think of someone in the Black community that are guilty of constantly ignoring the topic of discussion and using ad hominem attacks, drop their name below. And you know what it is. Death to the pseudos.